And now let's talk about structural racism and its effect on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are the indigenous people of three major regions of the Pacific: Melanesia, which include Fiji and Vanuatu; Micronesia, which includes the Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, and the Marshall Islands; and Palau; Polynesia, which includes American Samoa, Hawaii, Samoa, and Tonga. Europeans arrived in the Pacific Islands as early as the 16th century following Ferdinand Magellan's expedition for new trade routes. By the late 1700s, colonizers began arriving in great numbers with the intent to Christianize the Pacific Islanders, exploit their natural resources, and develop commerce. The arrival of these foreigners introduced infectious disease such as smallpox, measles, and influenza to the Pacific Islands. The indigenous people had no immunity, resulting in nearly decimating Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations within the following century. In addition, colonizers abducted many Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders to exploit their bodies and labor on plantations. By the late 1800s to early 1900s, international violent conflicts led to increased military occupation and eventually a takeover of many Pacific Islands by the United States. Following World War II, the United States used the Marshall Islands to conduct 67 thermonuclear tests, detonating an explosive yield equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs, an average of 1.6 Hiroshima bombs per day for 12 years between 1946 and 1958. This resulted in indigenous Marshallese and other Micronesians being exposed to high levels of radiation, causing acute health problems as well as increased risk for various cancers and metabolic diseases that persist to this day. The radiation deemed some islands completely uninhabitable and caused extensive environmental degradation, displacing Micronesians who had lived on those islands and disrupting the way of life that had sustained the health and the well being of the indigenous people for millennia. An example of structural racism against Pacific Islanders included the Compact of Free Association Treaty of 1980. In compensation for its role in inflicting harm through nuclear testing and to guarantee access to strategic areas, the United States signed the Compacts of Free Association treaties in the late 1980s with three nations in Micronesia: the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau. These agreements give the United States exclusive military access in exchange for funding for health and education infrastructure on these island nations. In addition, the COFA, the Compact of Free Association Treaties, migrants were allowed to freely enter and work in the United States without a visa. Today, the fastest growing Pacific Islander group in the United States came from the COFA countries, where many migrate to the United States to seek better economic opportunities. However, as many scholars and activists have argued, the US government has failed to uphold its obligations under the COFA treaties. Although COFA migrants are required to pay US taxes, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 removed their eligibility for federal programs, including Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. When considering structural racism against Pacific Islanders in the US, it's key to know that the invisibility of data for for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders is due to aggregation. Without the disaggregation of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander data, health departments and researchers can deny Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities the knowledge needed to mobilize actions to decrease disease risk and death in Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community members. and Native Hawaiian Pacific community members are unable to detect disparities and advocate for needed resources such as federal dollars, which can be allocated to hospitals, schools, transportation, and public assistance programs. Although it's been roughly 50 years since the US used the Marshall Islands to test thermonuclear bombs, the negative effects of a loss of home and health are reflected in today's statistics. As you can see here, Marshallese people stagger behind all races in the US when it comes to home ownership and is seen even here in Seattle. And although the Compact of Free Association Treaty promised access to healthcare programs to Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, the revocation of these programs have left Marshallese people without healthcare insurance to address the lasting effects of nuclear exposure. The broken promise of the Compact of Free Association Treaty is also seen in Pacific Islanders' education attainment here in the US. While Native Hawaiians are only doing slightly better than Black people in attaining bachelor's degrees in Seattle at 22%, some Pacific Islander groups are only getting a bachelor's degree at 1/3 to 1/2 that rate, such as Chamorros and Samoans. This lack of education can largely be traced back to the lack of access to primary education in Pacific Islands. For instance, research shows that nearly 40% of school children in Pacific Island countries do not complete primary school, and only 20% graduate from secondary school despite the US's promises to build necessary infrastructure to support education in these countries. The structural racism against Pacific Islanders can also be seen through their significant income and unemployment inequities. Several Pacific Islanders groups earn less than half of their white counterparts, where an average Marshallese person make 7,000 per capita, and Fijians, Native Hawaiians, and Samoans are 2 times as likely to be unemployed to their white counterparts. The US government, a case example of structural racism in Pacific Islanders includes the colonization of Hawaii. The US government backed an insurgence of white colonizers that overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, leading to the forceful annexation of Hawaiian Islands. For context, this colonization of Hawaii occurred less than 30 years after the abolition of slavery in 1865. In the years after annexation of the Hawaiian Islands, wealth was systematically stolen from Native Hawaiians by US colonizers, laying the basics for perpetuating economic marginalization across generations. The lasting effects of racism and white supremacy are apparent. Today, Native Hawaiians have lower wages, a higher likelihood of being homeless or incarcerated, and higher rates of chronic illness compared to other racial ethnic groups in their own homeland of Hawaii.